On final approach into Tegucigalpa, pilots flew straight at a mountain ridge, then banked hard at the last possible moment, dropping into a narrow valley and lining up on a runway that gave them almost no room to be wrong. There was no straight-in approach here. There never had been. To understand why, you have to go back to the 1930s. Tegucigalpa was never supposed to have an international airport at all. The capital of Honduras sits inside a bowl of mountains, ringed on every side by steep terrain, with no flat ground large enough for a proper runway anywhere close to the city center. Engineers picked the only open patch of land they could find, a narrow strip at the bottom of a valley, and built a short runway directly into it. At the time, aircraft were smaller, slower, and didn't need much room. Nobody building it in the 1930s imagined jets would ever try to land there. The city itself had only settled into that valley centuries earlier for the same reason the airport eventually failed it. The surrounding mountains offered natural defense and shelter, exactly the terrain features that make a runway impossible to expand. Then commercial aviation grew up around it, and the airport had no way to grow with it. Mountains rose on both ends of the runway, some peaks close enough that a straight-in approach was physically impossible without flying through solid rock. A ridge sat directly in the extended runway centerline on one side, forcing every arriving aircraft into a turn low over the city just to line up with the pavement. On the other end, the valley narrowed again, leaving no space to lengthen the strip. The airport could not grow outward without going through a mountain, and it could not grow upward without moving the city built around it. Runway upgrades that would have been routine anywhere else, adding length, widening the safety margins at each end, repositioning the approach, lighting, were simply not physically possible here, because there was no direction to expand into that didn't already have a mountain, a neighborhood, or a ridge in the way. So pilots learned to fly the mountain instead of around it. Aircraft approached the ridge head-on, then banked sharply, sometimes past 45 degrees, dropping altitude fast while turning on to final in one continuous motion. All of it done visually, by hand, with the runway only becoming visible in the final seconds of the turn. There was no instrument system that could fly this approach for you. Every crew had to see the valley, see the runway, and commit to the turn using judgment alone. Airlines required captains to complete specific training and simulator sessions for this airport before they were allowed to attempt it with passengers. The same way crews were checked out individually for a handful of the world's hardest approaches. For people living under the flight path, the descent became part of the city's daily rhythm. Rooftops in the neighborhoods ringing the valley sat close enough to the final turn that residents could watch pilots make the correction in real time, engines changing pitch as the aircraft rolled level just above the houses. Aviation enthusiasts treated the approach as a spectacle in its own right, gathering along the perimeter fence with cameras to watch each landing thread the same narrow gap between the same two ridgelines, the same way spotters elsewhere gather for a famously difficult approach. Taxi drivers near the airport said you could set your watch by the incoming international flights just from the sound of the turn overhead. There was no version of arriving in Tegucigalpa that didn't involve everyone on the ground looking up. Because the runway was short and the valley left no room to extend it, there was almost no margin once the wheels touched down. Land long, land fast, or land in wet conditions, and the aircraft could run out of pavement before it ran out of speed. On May 30th, 2008, American Airlines Flight 1002, a Boeing 757 arriving in heavy rain, touched down and could not stop in the distance remaining. It overran the end of the runway, crashed through a security fence, crossed a public road, and came to rest against an embankment. Several people on the ground and aboard the aircraft were killed. It wasn't the airport's first runway excursion, and aviation authorities had flagged the risk for years. But this crash finally forced the conversation that had been avoided for decades. This airport could not keep operating the way it always had. Investigators pointed to the same combination that had shadowed the airport since the jet age began: insufficient runway length, a wet surface, and a valley that gave crews no second chance to go around once they were committed to the final turn. The problem was, there was still nowhere in the valley for the runway to go. Extending it in either direction meant demolishing neighborhoods that had grown up around the airport over 80 years, or cutting directly into the mountains that made the approach dangerous in the first place. Every fix available inside that valley created a new version of the same problem. Air traffic kept growing anyway, By the 2010s, Tegucigalpa was handling international traffic through an airport that safety analysts openly ranked among the most demanding approaches for a major world capital, precisely because the terrain that made the city's capital location strategic centuries earlier now made its runway nearly impossible to expand. Every proposed fix ran into the same wall. You cannot widen a valley, and you cannot ask a capital city to relocate the mountains it was built inside of. The solution wasn't to fix the old airport, it was to abandon it. Authorities began converting a former U.S. military airbase at Palmarola, roughly 60 kilometers outside the city, into the country's new international gateway, with a runway long enough and approach paths clear enough that the old banking turn over the mountains would no longer be necessary at all. The project meant building an entirely new terminal, new air traffic infrastructure, new customs and cargo facilities, and a new highway link fast enough to move passengers between a distant airbase and a capital city that had built its entire aviation identity around one dangerous valley for nearly a century. Construction and conversion took years and required coordinating military, civil aviation, and transportation authorities simultaneously, because none of the existing infrastructure around Palmarola had been designed to move commercial passenger volumes. Runways built for military transport aircraft had to be reinforced and extended for scheduled airline traffic, and an airbase built to be isolated from the capital, deliberately, for security reasons decades earlier, suddenly had to become easy to reach. In May 2021, Palmarola International Airport opened, and Tegucigalpa's old airport stopped handling scheduled commercial flights after more than 80 years. Pilots who had trained for years to fly the mountain turned suddenly had a straight, unobstructed approach instead. The valley that had shaped every approach into the capital for generations was no longer part of the flight path at all. But moving the airport out of the valley didn't erase the trade-off. It just relocated it. Palmarola sits far enough from the capital that passengers now face a highway drive of well over an hour to reach the city center, turning a flight that used to end minutes from downtown into one that ends with a long transfer through mountain roads. The airport is safer. Getting to it, and getting out of it, became a different kind of obstacle. The valley approach that killed people is gone. The isolation that replaced it is just a slower, quieter version of the same original problem. This capital was built somewhere its geography never wanted an airport, and every solution since has been a negotiation with that same terrain. When you look at the history of aviation into Tegucigalpa, the story never really resolves. It just relocates. First, they wedged a runway into the only flat ground in a mountain bowl. Then, when the valley proved fatal, they moved the entire airport outside the mountains altogether, into a stretch of land with room to breathe but no easy road home. The mountains gave way to distance. The danger gave way to inconvenience. And an airport that spent 80 years fighting a valley now spends every day fighting the 60 kilometers of highway standing between it and the city it exists to serve. Proof that in this country, geography never really lets go. It just changes which problem it hands you next.